15 years ago or so, shortly after I got whacked, I remember reading a book by a psychologist named Dr. Larry Crabb called Finding God. The idea of knowing God through suffering, I believe, was his premise. I don't remember a lot of the details of the book, but I will never forget the dedication at the front of the book. He wrote, "To the memory of Dr. Charles Smith, a mentor, who prayed for his cancer to return if it would bring him closer to God. In his last year, he found God in a measure he had never known before, and then he died of cancer." Can you ever imagine that being your prayer? I mean, what did this guy know of God? Who did he know to authentically pray a prayer like that? That quote came to mind this week as I was considering the Bible passage for today. It's a story about Jesus and Jesus bringing healing to a man who was born blind, had spent his whole life, had never, ever seen. Terrible brokenness. And in the story, Jesus comes across this blind man with his disciples in tow, and the disciples ask, "Rabbi, who sinned?" The belief was that this had to be a quid pro quo kind of thing for something bad that somebody did sometime. "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" And Jesus replies, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him." And the mysterious truth of that statement reminded me of the mysterious truth of that dedicated quote. Jesus, knowing that this man was about to be healed physically of his blindness by him, saw the situation from a different perspective because he knew what was going to happen next. There was a knowing outside of what anyone else could have known in that moment. He had a larger, more eternal, divine view. He knew that God had a greater thing in mind than just what was apparent on the ground. Something that would reveal God's might and power and glory. And it was way more than just re-engaging and enlightening and illumining this man's two retina. Way bigger than that. This was a story of how those new eyes were then able to see something even greater. So, listen to the story. It's the whole chapter, and then we'll talk about it a bit. It's from the Gospel of John, chapter 9. As Jesus went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus, "but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. A night is coming when no one can work. While I'm in the world, I am the light of the world." And then, having said that, he spit on the ground, made some mud with his saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. "Go," he told him, "wash in the Pool of Siloam." That word means sent. And so the man went and he washed, and he came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" Some claimed that he was. Others said, "No, it only looks like him." But he himself insisted, "I am the man. I am the man." "How is it that your eyes were open?" they asked. And he replied, "The man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. And he told me to go to Siloam and wash, so I went and washed, and then I could see." "Where is this man?" they asked him. "I don't know," he said. They brought to the Pharisees, the church leaders of the day, the man who had been blind. Now, the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath, which for them was a day that you didn't do any work, especially a work or even a work like this. Therefore, the Pharisees asked how he had received his sight, and he said, "He put mud on my eyes." And the man replied, "And I washed, and now I see." And the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God. He does not keep the Sabbath." But the others asked, "How can a sinner perform such signs?" And so they were divided. And then they turned again to the blind man and said, "What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened." And the blind man replied, the formerly blind man replied, "He is a prophet." They still didn't believe that he had been blind and received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. "Is this your son?" they asked. "Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that he can now see?" "We know he is our son," the parents answered, "and we know he was born blind, but how he can now see or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He's of age. He'll speak for himself." His parents said that because they were worried that they were going to be tossed out of the synagogue by the Jewish leaders, who had already decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out. That's why his parents said, "He is of age, ask him." A second time, they summoned the man who had been blind to give glory to God and tell the truth. They said, "We know this man, Jesus, is a sinner." And he replied, "Whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, and now I see." Then they asked him, "What did he tell you to do? How did he open your eyes?" And he answered, "I've already told you, and you didn't listen. What do you want to hear? Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too?" And then they hurled insults at him and said, "You are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from." And the man answered, "Now, that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of the opening of the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." And to this they replied, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And they threw him out. Jesus heard that they'd thrown him out. And when he found the man, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" Son of Man is a rich word in the Old Testament, pointing to the Messiah. "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" "Who is he, sir?" the man asked. "Tell me so that I may believe in him." And Jesus said, "You've now seen him. In fact, he's the one speaking to you." And the man said, "Lord, I believe." And he worshiped him. And Jesus said, "For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind." Some Pharisees who were with him heard him say this and asked, "What, are we blind too?" And Jesus said, "If you were blind, you'd not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains." There is a seeing in behind your seeing. Behind and above and before and behind. This gospel story is about that kind of seeing, a greater seeing, a seeing that leads to an even greater seeing. Yes, this poor, blind man was able to see physically for the first time in his life, and that was a miracle. But what was even more brilliant and what dwarfed that miracle was what he then came to see when he looked into the face of Jesus Christ and discovered who he was. "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" Jesus said. "Who is he, sir?" Tell me so I may believe in him." And Jesus said, "You have now seen him. In fact, he's the one speaking to you. You are looking at me right now." And then something must have happened. The guy was already freaking out with this amazing miracle that had happened in his life. And already his faith was being built as he was pushing back on the religious establishment, which he thought was a lot of BS when it came to Christ. And then this moment, this beautiful moment where he professes his faith and he says, "I believe, Lord, I believe," and worshiped him. Whatever that means. Maybe he lost it. Those eyes that were just healed, maybe cried tears before the face of God like they never had before. This greatest miracle that he could now know and look into the face of God. Your eyes, that's what they're made for. You're made to see him. Your ears, yes, beautiful Bach music and the voice of your little girl singing and all of the knowledge that is gained through your hearing, but you're made for an even greater hearing. Your heart meant for a deeper knowing. Your mind for a much, much deeper understanding. Your soul is made to receive him. Lord, I believe. And if you believe, if you know what that means when you hear me say that, then maybe you do get what Dr. Smith had when he could pray a prayer like that. God, bring cancer back if it means I'm going to get you, like how I got you and you gave yourself to me when I was near death. I think when you believe or have some inclination of what that means, maybe you get that. If you believe, maybe you can understand Jesus' words. This happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him, and not hear them with cynical, skeptical eyes, ears, thinking, man, what a capricious, unfair setup, God. How manipulative that you would do that. If you believe, you could get that there's truth, very deep truth, in what Jesus is saying there. Your primary reason for being made by God through Christ, the reason you are here is to know him. And that not to diminish everything else that makes up life, the fullness and beauty of it. I think, in fact, all of that is meant to be something through which you also know him. A both and kind of thing. But your raison d'etre is to know God through Christ, to look into his face, to glorify God, to see God. The Westminster Catechism from 1647, some of you might remember that first Q&A. What is the chief end of man? Humanity. What is the chief end of humanity? Man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. You're made to know God.